Hello, everybody. Welcome to Conformity and Obedience, Chapter Part 1. So, we have already talked a little bit about this idea of social influence, though you may not have really realized it yet. Social influence normally consists of about three things: conformity, compliance, and obedience. We've already talked about compliance when we talked about the idea of giving a request and somebody complying to that request, saying yes or no. So, for example, when we're talking about trying to sell people things, and those persuasion tactics, we're talking about compliance techniques. Today, we're going to start talking about conformity, and in the next video, we'll talk about obedience. So let's talk about conformity today. When we're discussing this idea of social influence, conformity means a change in one's behavior due to the real or imagined influence of other people, right? So you're changing your behavior because of the influence of the other people. And you know what it's like to conform, right? You've done this before. Compliance, on the other hand, is getting yes to the request, and obedience means an extreme social influence where you have to follow the orders of an authority figure. So conformity is what we're going to talk about today. So, conformity. Why do people conform? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. It's not just because they want other people to like them, though that is a reason why. There are other reasons as well. Do they always conform? Well, the answer to that one we clearly know is no. People don't always conform. And so let's start with this question for you. Have you conformed today? If you said no, then you're a liar. I don't know. Maybe it's possible that you might not have conformed. I don't think that's true. I think that everybody has conformed today, meaning done something that just because they wanted to fit in or because they're just following what other people do. There's lots of ways that we conform in every day. We conform by wearing clothes. We conform by, to a certain extent, following rules. We conform when understanding what the social norm is, asking people how their day was, that kind of thing. They're all ways that different people conform to different things. Let's give an example. So these shoes are called hush puppies. And I don't know how many people wear hush puppies nowadays, but in 1994, not a lot of hush puppies were being sold. Okay, so the hush puppy brand, they sold about 30,000 pairs in 1994. And then suddenly something happened. A couple of cool people were spotted at a New York City club wearing hush puppies. Then in 1995, they sold 430,000 pairs. It became the fashion accessory of the year. In 1994, they were lame old people shoes. In 1995, they were hip and cool. What happened? Well, conformity happened. Some people said, hey, those people are wearing those. They're awesome. I want to wear them. Conformity. But let's discuss why people do things in two different reasons. One is just to follow the trend, and that's normally what you're talking about when you're talking about conformity. But there's other reasons to conform. So I want you to answer this question. On the first day of class, what did you do? Just give me kind of a rundown when you came to class the first time. If it's in person class, what did you do when you walked in the room? If it's online class, what did you do when you logged in for the first time, like on a video conference? Well, what you probably did on your first day of class is you looked around to figure out what was going on, right? So are people sitting down? Are people talking to each other? Are people sitting in a certain way? Are they doing a certain thing? Do they have their phones out? Do they have their books out? What's going on? Now, you probably didn't do that just so you're like, oh, I want people to think I'm awesome. That's probably not what you were doing. Probably not what you were doing. Instead, you were looking for a certain amount of information about, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? So one reason why people conform has to do with them thinking that it is the right answer, following what other people do because they think it is the right thing to do. Let's talk about Sharif in 1936. Sharif in 1936 did something called the Autokinetic effect study. Now, the Autokinetic effect, you can actually practice this if you want to. You have to have a pitch black room, totally black, totally pitch, right? Except for one point of light. The only light in the room can be that one point of light. So imagine like a laser pointer against the wall, And that is the only light that you see in the entire room, is that one dot of light. Okay, nothing else. Everything else is completely black. And what happens is if you look at that dot for a long time, pretty soon the dot will appear to start to move. And what's really happening is your eyeball actually has these things called extraocular muscles, and they're constantly twitching. Now, when those constantly twitch, they're picking up a lot of information. And normally we don't see twitches, even though right now your eyes are twitching. Normally we don't perceive the twitching because we have a lot of context to deal with, right? But when you take away that context and you're only looking at one thing, like one point of light, then suddenly you start to perceive these twitches in your eyeball. Even though the actual light is not moving, it appears to move. And so what Sharif did in 1936 is use this effect. And he brought people in, and he brought them in and had them look at this light bulb. Now what happened is that individuals arrived at their own estimate. So what their estimate was how much did the light move. So imagine people coming into this room, it's pitch black, can't see anything, they're looking at it, and Sharif is asking them, how much, like distance-wise, how much is that light moving? Okay? If people are by themselves, they'll come up with an individual norm, right? Their own estimate of what it is. Oh, I think it's moving, 3 inches, for example. In reality, it's not moving at all, right? And because you don't have any context, it's really, really difficult to make an estimate. So in reality, it's not moving at all. So if people are by themselves, they'll come up with their own individual norm. However, if you do the same study over a course of several different trials, and there's a lot of people in the room, several people in the room, and people are saying their estimates out loud, then you start to come up with something called a social norm, which is just based off of people copying each other, right? So here's what he did. He brought people in. Imagine there's like 5 people in the room. You ask, how much did the light move? What's the distance? And the first person says, oh, I think it's 3 inches. The next person says, no, I think it's 4 inches. The next person said, I think it's probably closer to 5 inches. The other person says, I think it's 3 inches. Okay? Versus if that first person had said, you know what, I think it's about 2 feet. I don't think it's 2 feet. I think it's about 1.5 feet. Oh, no, I think it's about 3 feet. I think it's about 5 feet, right? What's going on is people are using the information of other people to answer the question. They're using information from other people to get the right answer, to figure out what they actually should be responding to. Now, in reality, there is no right answer because the light's not moving at all, right? They're just guessing. And because they don't have a good context, because they don't have anything else to base it on, they base it off what other people are saying. And so we get something called informational social influence. Sharif's study is an example of informational social influence. People start to conform to what other people are saying. They conform to the social norm, right? So if it's inches, I think it's about 3 inches. The first person says, well, I think it's probably about, 2.5 inches. They're conforming to that norm of inches. Versus if somebody says, I think it's 2 feet, and the next person says, no, I think it's 3 feet, etc. They're conforming to a norm of feet. They're using the information from somebody else to answer the question. So if the behavior of others serves as a source of information, and that's why you're conforming to it, that is called informational social influence. Informational social influence is a form of conformity. But we're not doing it just to fit in. We're doing it because we honestly think that other people have information that help us to solve the problem. This is because, again, we think that other people have more accurate information, and it leads to private acceptance. That is, if you are actually conforming based off of informational social influence, you honestly think that that is the right answer. Okay, so if you're conforming, 3 inches, I think it's about 3.5 inches. If you're conforming to that idea of inches, you actually believe that that is the right answer to this particular problem. Private acceptance of the social norm. Now, it doesn't have to be just in like asking questions. There's other ways that we also do this kind of informational social influence. And we will talk about those at a later time. Now, let's answer this question. Do you have or have you ever had any of the following? So, if you've ever had a tattoo or a piercing or anything like that, then you have probably done it based off an idea of conformity, right? You're trying to fit in with some sort of a norm. You probably didn't do that based off of informational social influence, however. You probably did that based off of a different kind of social influence, which we'll talk about as normative social influence. So let me give you a couple examples. So this picture is in Rio de Janeiro for a while. It was a common thing for people to do train surfing. What they would do is they either get up on top of the train or right next to a train, and they would surf on electrical trains. Now, I don't think anybody said, "Gosh, I don't know how to ride a train. What should I do?" Oh, look, those guys over there, they're climbing up on top where all the electricity is, and they're riding the train. I think I'm going to do that. That's a good idea. That must be the right answer. No, no, they didn't think that's the right way to ride the train. They did it because their friends were doing it. Normative social influence. This other one has to do with ideas of eating disorders. Now, I got to be really careful here. I do not believe that all eating disorders are a form of conformity. However, it does seem very clear that there are social norms regarding body image and purging behaviors that have been studied and seem to be caught on and brought up within specific groups. And by specific groups, we're often talking about adolescent to young adult women. That is a very, very common group when those kind of norms are being coming in. So I don't know that anybody really thinks that that purging is a particularly good way to eat food, right? To have a good body image. I think instead it happens more because of ideas of conformity. Now, to be really careful, I am not saying that all eating disorders are just conformity. That's not what I'm saying. They're much more complicated than that. And if you or somebody you care about has an eating disorder, I really, really encourage you to have them get help immediately, because those are very, very, very serious kinds of, at least they can be very, very serious kinds of disorders. But the idea here is not that they think that is the correct information. It is just because their friends are doing it. Let's talk about normative social influence. So we already talked about informational social influence. Now we need to talk about normative social influence. Social influence. Solomon Asch. Solomon Asch. We actually have heard about Asch before when we were talking about central peripheral traits earlier. But Solomon Asch, his most famous study has to do with this idea of conformity. And the way he did this is he had lines. In this case, he would project them on a screen. Then he had a group of people. And that group of people, think about like 10 people sitting at a semicircular table, right? Sitting around a table, about 10 people. All of those people were Confederate except for one. Now, by Confederate, remember, that means that they're in on the study, right? A Confederate is somebody who's in on the study, an actor who's pretending to be something else. So all of them were pretending to be participants in the study, but in reality, there's only one real participant. And that participant is the second to last person in the group. And so what they would do is they'd show a standard line. They would do this many, many times. They'd show a standard line, and then they'd show comparison lines, and they would ask, all right, which one of those comparison lines is closest in length to the standard line? And they would go one by one out loud. So participant one, remember participant one is a Confederate, would say, oh, I think it is. And they would start off normal, right? They would start off normal and say, oh, I think it's 2. The next person would say, it's 2, 2, 2, 2. And they would do this over and over and over again. And over time, the Confederates were told to just say what the person in front of them said. So for example, over time, suddenly the first participant, who is a Confederate, would say, oh, I think it's line number 1. The next person would say line number 1. The next person would say 1. The next person would say 1, 1, 1, until finally it came to the real participant. The real participant then would have to say out loud what they thought was the correct answer. It turns out that, according to Asch's study, 76% of the participants conformed on about a third of 12 trials. Now, we're not saying that everybody conformed here, but about 76% conformed on a third of the trials. when it was obvious that their answer was incorrect. Now, let's make sure we're totally clear about this. In these experiments, in these experiments, it was pretty clear what the right answer was. So it wasn't an informational social influence. It's not like they're saying, oh gosh, I don't have good information about which one of these lines is closest to the standard line. No, they knew which one was the closest to the standard line, but the other people were telling them it was number one. And they're like, oh, I don't know. And they would say one just to fit in. The difference between informational social influence and normative social influence is that sometimes normative social influence happens. That is when we conform even when we know that it's not the objectively correct answer for something. So the normative reasons they would give were like, here's the group, they had a definite idea, I disagreed, I didn't want to stick out, I didn't want to feel like a fool, I didn't want them to think I was peculiar because, it's back in the 50s and they said words like peculiar, right? But they would give normative reasons. I didn't want to stick out. I didn't want to be weird. I didn't want to be strange. So people conformed even when it was clearly informationally incorrect. Normative social influence. People conform in order to be liked or accepted. Now, what do they conform to? They conform to the social norm. Now, these are implicit or explicit rules that people give. Okay? Social norms. Now, unlike informational social influence, normative social influence leads to public compliance, but not necessarily private acceptance. So, for example, when you go back to those people in Ash's line study and say, hey, why did you say that? They said, well, everybody else was saying it. I thought it was something else, but everyone else is saying it. So publicly, I'm complying with the norm, complying with the social norm. All right. Let's do some review questions. Review questions. Answer these right now. Okay. So when we do something like stand in line in an airport we've never been to, then we use informational social influence. We conform due to informational social influence. When you perhaps maybe go to a restaurant for the first time, you're like, gosh, how do we order? How does this work? You look around what other people are doing in order to understand what it is you're supposed to do. Informational social influence. However, if you're just doing it because other people think you should, then that's the conformity that your parents said, oh, well, if your friends jumped off the bridge, would you do it too? That is normative social influence, okay? Conformity can be either normative social influence or informational social influence. Those are both forms of conformity. Now, how many people need to be conforming? How many people have to have this happening in order for you to conform? So I want you to imagine this scenario. Let's say that you're walking down a busy street in the city, and you see a bunch of people on the sidewalk looking up at the building across the street. How many people would need to be looking up at the building across the street in order for you to stop and also look up at the building across the street? Well, what we have found is you only need about 3 people for you to get maximum amounts of conformity. Let's go ahead and watch this video. Okay, so in this particular study, this was a Milgram study, yes, but it wasn't the Milgram study. We'll talk about that one later on. He had people look at the window of his office at NYU, which happened to be up a little ways, right? And he would have different a number of people on the street looking up, starting with 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. And what he found was that once you get to about 3 or more people, the conformity was about equal, right? You have very little increase in conformity after you get about 3 people doing a behavior. So if 1 person is looking up, you'll get a few people maybe glancing. With 2, you get more. With 3, you get a lot more. And 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those are all about equal in terms of the amount of conformity you get for something like looking up at a window. That means that there's diminishing returns in terms of the group size compared to the conformity, right? There's diminishing amount of conformity based off of the increase in numbers of people after you get to about 3 people. Okay, let's keep going. Oh, you'll also get a lot more conformity when that group is important to the person you're trying to see if they're going to conform, right? So, for example, I'm not particularly influenced by Brazilians in Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro who are, surfing, right? They're not my peer group. I don't care. But if they are your peer group, then you do care. Then you do care. If they're your classmates, if they're your roommates or somebody else, then you might care a lot more depending on whether the group is important to you. Okay, so what we looked at the difference between informational social influence and normative social influence. They are both a form of conformity. We saw that Sharif is an example of informational social influence with his autokinetic effect, that other people's behavior, according to informational social influence, other people's behavior serves as information on ambiguous situations. It leads to private acceptance. And we do that when the situation is ambiguous and other people are experts. Normative social influence can be demonstrated by Solomon Asch. And Asch showed that people conform in order to be liked or accepted. It leads to public compliance, but not necessarily private acceptance. If the group size is 3 or more and the group is important, then people are going to conform more. We need to talk about that last little part, having no allies in the group. And we'll get to that in just a little bit when we talk about minorities. What that's saying is that if you did Asch's line study, but you had one of the other Confederates say the correct answer when all the rest were saying the wrong answer, then the conformity plummeted. It went way down, way, 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 way down. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, we need to talk about one other idea, and that is social contagion. There's another form of conformity called social contagion. So, have you ever been in this class where students started to loudly close and zip their backpacks up and get ready to go, right? And then everybody else starts doing it. And you're not necessarily doing it because you want to fit a social norm. And you're not necessarily doing it because you know it's the right thing to do. It is not the right thing to do, by the way. Don't do that while your teacher's talking. Anyway, but it is not the right thing to do. It seems to be a social contagion. It seems to be something that just kind of, like a virus, spreads through and people start doing it. In the same way, if you're waiting in the right lane in a traffic jam and then people start going onto the shoulder and passing, well, we know that that's not normative social influence. People aren't doing it so that they can fit in with the group, because the majority of people aren't necessarily doing that, right? It's not like we're trying to fit in with the group. And you know objectively that it is the wrong thing to do. It is not right. There seems to be a contagion, though, of specific behaviors that people do, right? Social contagion is when there are different behaviors that just kind of happen more like a virus, not necessarily because people are wanting to fit in or because they're trying to do the right information, just kind of catches on in a weird way. All right? Okay. So do people always conform? Well, no, they don't always conform. And one good example is minority influence. So I want you to think about this in the same terms of what we just talked about with Asch's line study. And if somebody said no, right? If one of the other Confederates gave the correct answer, the actual participant is much more likely to also give the correct answer. So Moscovici found that a minority group influences the behavior or beliefs of the majority if the minority has a consistent behavior. That's got to be consistent, right? If they're consistent, even though it's clear that it's not going with the norm, if they're consistent, they can cause a change. So, for example, innovations in science and technology were based off of minorities, right, starting to influence majorities. Okay, it wasn't a social norm to use a cell phone for a long time. The minority of people made it much more acceptable. This can also happen in changes in political attitudes, right? If you have somebody that you trust who consistently gives a differing opinion, then that opinion stands out more and doesn't always, can lead to changes in political attitudes. It can also be ideas of fashion, right? Ideas of fashion tend to start with minorities, not majorities. Unfortunately, things like terrorism can also be an idea of minority influence. We don't believe, obviously it's not a normative social influence for people to join terrorist groups, but they can be influenced by minorities of people. Okay, let's go ahead and look then. Majority influence includes ideas of normative influence. But informational influence can be done through a minority, right? Or through a majority. So majority influence normative influence has to have a majority influence, generally, okay? It's based off the power of the social norm and leads to public compliance. But informational influence can happen through majorities or minorities when people behave because they must be the right thing to do. It's based off of a minority doing consistent behaviors that are not necessarily the social norm. All right. Thanks, everybody. Let's go ahead and stop there.